Welcome, everybody. If anybody has just wandered in off the street, you are in the midst of Design for Social Innovation at SVA. This is our weekly lecture series, and when we have some really special programming, we put it on steroids and come here and invite lots of other people. The context and the purpose of this lecture series is to expose our students to as broad a range of people and issues in social innovation as possible. So we're interested not only in understanding how people solve social issues, but we're also interested in how it is that people make big, amazing lives and careers in social innovation. So our students are all in the process of making big, exciting careers for themselves in social innovation. There's 2 cohorts here. So if you don't know them, please introduce yourselves and have a conversation with them. And if you are not already one of our students and you want to apply, please do that as well. I don't think Despina is here, but I want to thank Despina Papadopoulos, who is one of our thesis faculty, who originally made this connection for us. So Despina, wherever you are, thank you. So we're going to roll the film and then hear from some extraordinary people, led by Skyler Brown, our fantastic faculty member for this lecture.
So, hi, everybody. Welcome. Can we just quickly sort of like, just feel the end of that movie for a second? Gabrielle just said to me, well, it's going to be a little bit tough to talk after that. But maybe let's just give a round of applause for the film first. Very, very powerful. So thank you for being here, everybody who's here. I'm Skyler Brown, and I host the guest lecture series for the Design for Social Innovation program. So most Wednesday nights we're meeting a couple streets down on 21st Street in our cozy small auditorium. And we have every Wednesday night a guest lecturer from the world of social innovation or social justice or whatever, all of these fields, these social fields. And the point of the guest lecture series is to expose our students to the various paths that are available to them and to hear directly from the experience of the people who are changing the world for the better, groups that are changing the world for the better. And we hear from them personally, we view their work. And once a year, we do an event here at the theater. And this year, when we were introduced to Tirtza's film and this piece of work, we felt like this warranted a bigger forum, that it felt like something that deserved more attention. I feel so strongly that's the case. And while this is a hard subject, I mean, it's incredibly heavy and really tough to look at and to face. It feels like that's part of, it's part of our responsibility to know about these things as citizens of a country where this is happening. And as hard as it is, as weighty as it is as a subject, I was really looking forward to tonight. I was really looking forward with great anticipation to tonight because, in part, because of the people that I've met on the journey towards putting this event together. And the people who are sitting up here on the stage with me. And their work, they are truly inspirational. Their work is inspirational and hopeful. And so I'm going to just quickly introduce the folks here on the panel. And then I'm going to give each of them a couple minutes to tell you about what they're working on and what they do, and maybe also just respond to the film a little bit. So that's where we'll start. And right here to my left is Tirtza Even. Tirtza is a video artist and documentary maker. She's produced both linear and interactive video work examining social, political dynamics in specific locations. So Palestine, Turkey, Spain, the US and Germany, among others. And her work has appeared at the Museum of Modern Art at the Whitney Biennial, the Johannesburg Biennial, as well as many other festivals, galleries, and museums in the U.S., Israel, and Europe. So welcome, Tirtza. Thank you. Stephen Watt, there to her left, is a senior staff attorney with the ACLU's Human Rights Program, where he specializes in civil and human rights litigation before domestic courts and international tribunals. He is counsel in a host of state and federal court cases involving U.S. rendition, detention, and interrogation programs, trafficking and forced labor, juvenile justice, women's and immigrants' rights, and prison conditions. So it's really wonderful to have you here, Stephen. Yuval, there. So Yuval Shir is Deputy Director of the New York Center for Juvenile Justice, where he oversees the development and implementation of programs, including its effort to build a New York statewide advocacy network, which will be active in colleges, faith-based organizations, and community organizations. This effort is aimed at transforming our juvenile justice system by encouraging a more robust and candid public discussion, which we hope to have here tonight. So get your questions for these folks ready. And finally, last but not least, Gabrielle Horowitz-Prisco is director of the Juvenile Justice Project at the Correctional Association of New York. She oversees all of the project's principal activities, including developing and implementing youth justice reform, advocacy strategies, and coordinating the Juvenile Justice Coalition. So thank you so much for being here, all of you. If we could just get a round of applause for our panelists. And just a word on the format here. So we asked the students in our in the program, in the DSI program, to prepare and submit some questions in advance. So the questions that I'll be asking, and I'm just going to ask a few, are from the students, and then we will open up the discussion to the audience. So there should be mics. There's mic. What did we decide? Okay, that's right. You're just going to lob in the questions, and I'm going to repeat them. So, well, let's start first, actually. I just want to give you a moment, just a few moments each. Tirtza, if you want to start and talk a little bit about your experience making the film.
What I wanted to focus on, and then I'll answer more detailed questions, but what I wanted to show, especially in this context, is two more versions of this project, and so that the conversation about format or form could be more informed. So we're going to look at the installation version. I think, yeah, this is it. So this is one of the versions. The piece was made as a threefold project. It was made for a single channel, which is what you are watching here today. It was made to be installed in a gallery setting, and what you're looking at here is a recent show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit. And in that situation, the piece itself folds into a corner, and across from it are two benches that together form the scale of a cell, so that when you sit in the space, you really inhabit that landscape that the film takes place in. And alongside that, I worked with Ivan Martinez, who is a designer and a sculptor, and he produced these 5 sets of concrete bedrolls. And when you enter prison, the one thing you're given is a blanket and a pillow. And what he did is cast those in concrete and scaled them down to kid size. And so each one of these is basically dedicated to the 5 protagonists of the piece. On them are the date of their birth and the date of their arrest. And basically between those 2 dates, you get the sense of their the span of their life as a free person before entering prison. And along with that are a booklet that you can see on that shelf on the side, which gives a lot of the statistics data and the history of the legal issue. So it becomes a much more broad environment for investigating the issue, where the film is just one component of the various other data. So this is version number 2, and then there's version number 3 that we're gonna, I'll just show you a demo of. It's not yet finished, it's gonna be finished in a month, and that's an interactive database for all the other many hours of interviews. The material that fit into the piece is shrunk by maybe 40. There are maybe 40, 50 hours of interviews with many people that were involved in each of the cases, and experts of sorts, psychiatrist, warden, legal spokesperson. You see moments of some, but much of their conversation is absent. Also, the stories of each of the inmates are told in depth. And so basically what will happen here is very simple to operate, navigable space open to the public, where you can explore the stories and go in detail into each one of them, or into any one of the ones that you're more interested in. So we're going to show you just a 1-minute demo, and that will give you kind of the broad range of this whole project.
The middle child. I have a brother that's 8 years older, a sister that's 7 years older. I didn't have many friends, but I grew up I had 2 brothers. I had an older brother and I had a younger brother. I was real sensitive to
There were several concerns that I had back then, and it's nearly 20 years ago. Certainly it was the gravity of the offense. And as you read...
And she always lived around our neighborhood. They had their own home, but she went to Pontiac school. She was a good girl. She was a very good.
So basically what you can see
from that point on
is that there are a front area where you can navigate the inmates themselves. I think we're good. You can navigate the inmates' stories and hear each of them unfold for about half an hour. And for each one of them, you can go to the other side and hear the various people that spoke on their stories, ranging from the police, detectives, to the judges, lawyers, family members, etc. So it just gives you access to the material that from which I drew the edited version of the film.
Hi, so I'm a lawyer with the American Civil Liberties Union, and as Skyler said in the introduction, I deal with a whole host of issues, one of which is juvenile justice. But of most relevance to tonight's conversation, I'm presently litigating a case with Deborah LaBelle, who was featured in the documentary, on behalf of juveniles who are subjected to life without parole in the Michigan system. And that case is presently before the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And it will impact, we hope, the lives of there's some 350 individuals who were sentenced as children to life without parole sentence in Michigan. The second largest number in the states around the country, Pennsylvania being the first. And as I think it was mentioned in the documentary, the United States is the only country in the world that subjects children to life without parole sentences. There's over 2,500 children or individuals who were sentenced to life without parole, serving those sentences around the country. There's none in the rest of the world. And I found your documentary. This is the first time I've known of this documentary for some time now, as Tirtza has worked on it with Deb LaBelle. But this is the first time that I've seen it, and I found it incredibly powerful. I've actually met and I've sat across the table from 3 of these individuals. And what is the most powerful thing about this is it humanizes in a way that our litigation can't. It's a really powerful medium film for this particular issue, and I really commend it highly. And you coming out tonight, I think, is action in itself. Thank you.
So it actually brings me to how I got here, because as you can notice, there's a similarity in accent. There are 2 Israelis in the panel, and we're taking over. But the way I got to this film, I've been working on this issue of children being tried as adults in New York, training judges who preside over the cases of youth, really trying to develop a more developmentally sensitive response for these kids that are in the adult court. And one of the things that always struck me about this issue of automatically trying children as adults is really that the whole idea is to really take out these kids from their context as kids. It's about what they have done, period. And I can talk later about how we got here. But I really felt that art and film are a source of hope, because at least in the public eye, art can actually bring back the context of who these kids are. So I was basically going on Kickstarter searching for what people are doing, and that's how I came across. And I actually became a funder of the film. It was very exciting to see this process, and to be. I love Kickstarter, but that's my short message to you as artists and as people who are working on creating these experiences that enable people to view an issue in a different manner. If you can bring these kids to the public eye in a different context than what they have done in a specific moment in their lives, I think you will create an environment where we will be able to undo some of the damages of these laws. And I can talk later about how we got here.
Thanks. As I was saying, I do this work for a living, and it's heavy. But I really feel so particularly moved. I was like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to speak. Really, what a film, and thank you for giving it to us in the world. It's needed. I direct the Juvenile Justice Project at the Correctional Association of New York. We're a 170-year-old organization that was founded by concerned citizens. So I always like to say that because I'm really moved by that history. We were founded by people who were concerned about what was going on behind the prison walls that the public doesn't see. And we have legislative access since 1846 to go inside prisons and monitor conditions of what's happening inside. And then we also do legislative and policy work. And the part of the work that I direct relates to legislative and policy advocacy about conditions for children inside both adult jails and prisons and in the youth justice system. I coordinate a coalition called the Juvenile Justice Coalition that is open to anyone in this room, where we're community members, professors, lawyers, service providers, attorneys, people who are interested in making things better for young people. And we focus primarily right now on LGBTQ youth who are inside the system, and also conditions of confinement inside detention and placement, jails and prisons for kids. And then we do a lot of work on raising the age of criminal responsibility, which Yuval mentioned, which basically means New York is one of only 2 states where 16 is the age at which you are an adult for the purpose of the criminal justice system and no other purpose. And it doesn't matter what the crime or the alleged crime is. It's automatic prosecution as an adult for anyone arrested for something that allegedly took place after their 16th birthday. And we also in New York prosecute kids as young as 13 in adult court for more serious crimes, 13, 14, and 15-year-olds. And we house children in adult jails and prisons in New York automatically, again, at 16 and 17 and without separation from adults. And there's no judge can override that. The law says you are 16, at 16 you're an adult. Young people, as you know, are on Rikers Island. They're in adult prisons that we monitor. And I guess I just the last thing I want to say, we also run programs for young kids to train them to be advocates for reform. And I was really moved when I was invited to speak, because I think a lot about, and I haven't really gotten to do much work around this question of what is the role of design in the prison system. And I know that that's addressed a little bit in some of the gallery piece that we saw, but I really think about, and so our organization is called the Correctional Association. In the 1800s, that meant something progressive. It doesn't anymore. So people think we're correction officers. So I get these catalogs, I was saying on a phone call, that are like Corrections Institutions of America catalog. And it's like, here's where you can buy those bedrolls, for $1 each or whatever. But also here's where you can buy restraint chairs, and where you can buy, handcuffs and restraints and metal boxes. And, one of the young people in the movie was talking about having their legs cuffed and their arms cuffed and a belt around their waist, and those are commodities. That's an industry. And I think sometimes about what are the role of the people who design those things, who design solitary confinement cells and restraint chairs. And so I'm interested to talk to people who are looking to use design for good in the world, to also raise some of these questions about what do we as a society decide how people should be treated, and then how is that manifested in everything from, the tray you saw in the film as the way that food was served, which, even that tray was so dehumanizing. So thanks.
Absolutely, thank you. Okay, so the first question I want to ask, I think, will maybe set a little context for the subject of life without parole. The question comes from Liz, and the question is, it's a two-part question. The first part, how would you gauge the general public's knowledge of life without parole? I didn't know it was even an option until this documentary. That's what Liz said. And I really identified with that because I also didn't know. I just didn't know. And I wonder, can we get a show of hands? How many of you, this is the first time you're sort of understanding the life without parole for juveniles or kids? Yeah. I'm trying not to feel embarrassed about that and just accepting it. Now I know. But I wonder, the second part of her question is, do you see any changes in the system coming in the next 5 to 10 years? So it feels like maybe this is just a good opportunity to talk about how we got here and where things are going with this. Like, how is this even possible?
Can you hear me? So the interesting story, we're kind of looking at Michigan, and we're like, it's Michigan, and what do they do over there? And look at the side, but and you can correct me on this, but I don't think that there was ever legislation passed saying we're going to try juveniles for life without parole. What happened was that juveniles were being tried as adults, and as a result, they were exposed to this sentence. And you have to understand that this whole concept of trying children automatically as adults and looking at them in accordance with the crimes they committed and not in accordance to their individuality was born here in New York. It was born here in New York in 1978. 1978 was a gubernatorial election in New York. Hugh Curry was running against a law and order candidate. And along came a boy by the name of Willie Bosket. He was 15 at the time. And at the time, New York had actually a very progressive law. If you were, the age of criminal responsibility was 16. It was always the case in New York. But in New York, if you committed any crime and you were below the age of 16, you would be tried as a juvenile, period. There was no process of waiver up. And many would say that that was a mistake because it exposed the system in a way to public outrage. What happened, came this young boy, very troubled individual, also unfortunately very charismatic, and he knew how to speak with the press in a provocative way. He came forward, he killed 2 people in the subway, and during this gubernatorial election, suddenly the public became outraged. This kid who just murdered 2 people in the subway, and he's bragging about his crimes, he's going to basically face 5 years of placement. What are we doing over here? We need to do something. And Governor Hugh Carey was really feeling that he's going to lose these elections. And overnight, without a single hearing, while the legislature was in recess, they passed what is called the Juvenile Offender Law, which basically took the bodies of these kids, these 13-year-olds accused of murder, 14 and 15-year-olds accused of other crimes, and regardless of their individuality, it wasn't a process where there's going to be a hearing to determine whether this kid can be amenable to treatment, like the hearing that was discussed in the film. They would go automatically into the adult court. and this obviously created a crisis because there weren't any services for these kids, and by the way, this is still the law. If you go to Manhattan, what they call the youth part, which the part that my boss established to try to ameliorate some of, or to counteract some of the damage of this law, you will see 14-year-olds sitting in an adult court, and you will see how their feet don't reach the ground and how they're doodling all kind of things while the defense attorneys and the prosecutors talk, and they just don't understand anything. So this is where it was born. And after New York passed it, people said, this is New York. This is a progressive state. This is going to be the model. And state after state passed the exact same law. And that's how we got here. And I think that maybe the message here is that if we want to undo this in the rest of the country, we have to deal with it in the place where it was born. And we have to really reach a point where we're going to repeal the juvenile offender law, and instead of it have a process where children would be viewed according to who they are, according to their individuality. And you will have sometime a child who poses danger. There are children who have been damaged so badly, who have such deep issues that they require a lengthy stay at a residential facility. I don't dispute that. But at least we have to undo this in New York. And I think that after we undo this in New York, and it's not something that's going to happen immediately, but and it will require a lot of work from you, a lot of work from us. Once we undo this in New York, I can imagine it going away in other states.
Maybe I'll just comment on. So over the last several years, the U.S. Supreme Court has weighed into this issue of life without parole for children. And so several years back, the court struck down as unconstitutional. It said it was cruel and unusual punishment for a state to sentence a child to a life without parole sentence for a non-homicide crime, so one that didn't involve murder. And then a year after that, in another case, the Supreme Court struck down as unconstitutional these types of mandatory life without parole sentences, even for homicide crimes, for murder. And what the court now requires, and what the law now requires, is individual consideration of the child's circumstances, which before, in I think some 25 states, it was the case that a judge, like as in Michigan, a judge could not consider child status at all. They had to automatically give a life without parole sentence for certain murder offences. So there is hope in the Supreme Court, from the Supreme Court, and what the Supreme Court has taken on board in these decisions is, and you heard it mentioned here in the documentary, is brain science. It's the work of researchers over the last 10 years or so that show that physiologically children are different, that their brains aren't as fully formed, that the brain is still developing up until age 25, and as a consequence of that, the court that was part of the court's reasoning is that children are less culpable for their actions because physiologically their brain isn't developed to the point that it has done in adults. So I think there is actually hope in the judicial system, and also as the Supreme Court's been weighing in, so too there's movements around the country in various state legislators to change laws to bring them into line with what the Supreme Court has found to be cruel and unusual punishment. So I think there is some hope, but again, it's not going to happen overnight. And I think what's really crucially important is as many different mediums as possible to inform the public, because at the end of the day, change of laws are brought about by individuals and voting and policymakers. So there is a role to play. It's a very slow one, and you have to be tenacious and you have to persevere.
I just want to add, for those who are kind of still unfamiliar with the law, and it took me a long time as a layperson to master these intricacies. There are three things that were left unsaid by the Supreme, many more, but initially the large components are three that were left unaddressed by the Supreme Court. First of all, they didn't rule out life without parole for juveniles, so the judge can still rule. They have freedom to choose, but that's still on the table as an option. They didn't rule out waiving, what is called waiving the juvenile into the adult system, which is what Yuval was bringing up, so that was not discussed. And the last thing, which is very much on the table in terms of the legal conversation now, is that they didn't say if this new reconsideration of the issue applies retroactively to the 2,500 kids that are inside. It's only applying forward in the language of the law. So that's another space for battle.
That issue is actually up before the Supreme Court and will be decided probably next year. They've just recently taken another case on life without parole.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things still that need to be changed, is the bottom line.
Yeah.
I have a question here from Lauren. She asks, why did you choose, Tirtza, to focus on the personal stories of the inmates rather than make specific calls to action on the broader issue? I think we've started to address it, but would love to hear you talk about that.
I guess my answer would be twofold. One is that that's how I think, from the individual out, and I maybe just stay at the individual. I don't know if I can even wrap my head around the legal conversation or where it's at any moment. And I'm not sure, and this is more of a choice beyond my own need, that conversation that publicly, to people like you and me, would hit home as much if we stayed at that level. I think that actually humanizing the encounter that I have and extending that encounter so that you might have through me an encounter with the individuals that are at stake is maybe the only way for real change to take place, at least on the level of our awareness as a broader public. I think that just to call for action would just emphasize or kind of wave a flag that is being waved, but without making an argument for it. And I think the only way, for me at least, to be convinced is through a one-to-one conversation with the person that's at stake on either side of the fence. And that's how I think empathy is the only tool I know that really can force conversation to take place. And so that's where I'm trying for, kind of extend mine to you.
Great. You're nodding a lot, Gabby. I wonder if you see that. I mean, just, in your personal experience or in your experience recruiting others to be concerned.
I do have to say, sometimes, like, when I see a film, both are necessary, and it's hard for me. Every time I see a film like this, I'm like, did I do the wrong thing? Like, should I go to film school? Like, because I do feel that it's very hard working on legislative or policy change. I mean, for me, I'm driven by what I experienced. I represented children in family court in both child abuse and neglect cases and youth justice cases. And that's just another piece of the film that really struck me, is how many of the children were themselves, if not all of them, and we didn't hear all of their childhood stories in so much detail. But, abuse, neglect, trauma, sexual abuse, the things that often are why kids wind up in the justice system, they are themselves, profoundly traumatized. And I think helping people to have compassion and empathy, it's one of the ways we get at that as human beings is by storytelling. It's by connecting. It's by knowing each other. And I really loved what you said about sort of, I can extend mine to yours. I thought that to you, I thought that was so beautiful that you can have empathy and then that you can be a vehicle as an artist, a channel for others to have empathy and extend their empathy. I also just want to say for a second that I think it's really important, although I work in the youth justice field and I believe very much in, the brain science that Stephen talked about the adolescent brain, but I also think our society really throws away adults too, and that there is a desperate need in this society for compassion and empathy. And I'm not saying that anyone on, here disagrees with that, but just to say, I think sometimes in the youth justice world, we can often sort of hang our hats on this claim that children are different. But the US stands alone in most of the world in terms of sentences of life, period, even for adults, in terms of not seeing prison as a place where there can be rehabilitation. The New York Times just had a whole magazine dedicated to this, and it was fascinating, and they profiled, countries all over the world compared to the US, and it's worth looking up online if you didn't see it. And I just want to, I guess, say that too, that all people deserve empathy and compassion, and that is not at odds, as I see it, with accountability. And often there's a forced choice in our dialogue. You've all talked a little bit about a gubernatorial race, right? And we are force-fed as a public a lie. And the lie we are force-fed is that we have to choose between holding people accountable and between compassion. And those things are not mutually exclusive. And some of the most profound movements in the field of justice are things like restorative justice that take into account very deeply accountability and also compassion for everyone involved, and thinking about the justice system as a place potentially of healing, not just a place of punishment. And that is a really deep conversation that has many, many layers to it, but it is true for adults as it is for children.
That's wonderful. And you touched on a couple of questions that different people had. And one that, this is a sort of a specific question that anybody can address, but and maybe the last one I'll ask before we'll open it up. But this is from Leora. And she asked, what education opportunities are available for inmates sentenced to life without parole? And has anyone, well, let's start with that, because it's shown in the movie that, somebody in the movie said basically they just prepare these children for life in prison. And then you see the man learning to read. Was he learning to read? Or?
He just looks at the dictionary every day. That's part of his routine, and tries to learn a few new words.
Yeah. And I think, what Leora was getting at in her questions was, is there any sense or desire to explore rehabilitation? She asks the second part, has anyone calculated the costs of keeping a person in prison for life versus the costs of rehabilitation? So if you wanted to speak to
let me speak to the local, because I know what happens in Michigan. They are, as a former warden that was on the documentary there said, they're just warehoused. They're put in these adult prisons, and because they have a life without parole sentence, the prison staff, they're assigned low priority for any rehabilitative programs, because they're never going to see the light of day. So what's the point in rehabilitation? So they're put to the end of the line if they're given any programs at all. So there is no rehabilitative goal in a life without parole sentence, and as a matter of practice in Michigan anyway, and I'm sure in other states around the world, or around the nation rather, there is no programming for them. There is no rehabilitative goal of a life without parole sentence.
There you have it. Well, so does anyone have any questions out there? Do you want to ask something to these? Yeah. have to just repeat the question for the video quickly. Thank you so much. So she's asking, I think, about the retroactivity on these laws and the fact that she's feeling really in a state of limbo, not sure what to do or where to go. And so, anyone?
Yeah, so the Supreme Court has recently reached down and it's going to take this case. It's a case from Louisiana, and it's going to answer the question as to whether or not an earlier decision that said that you cannot sentence a child to life without parole sentence without considering their child status, whether that prohibition applies to all 50 states. We're, as in the community, we're pretty confident that the Supreme Court will rule that it is retroactive, that their decision is retroactive. And that then will put it on to the states to set up a system that allows for a meaningful opportunity for everyone that had been sentenced to a life without parole sentence, a mandatory life without parole sentence, some meaningful opportunity for their release, to be considered for release. Because that's what's really important for everyone here to understand, is that what these individuals are seeking is just a second chance. It's to have a second look, to find out whether they have rehabilitated or not. And therefore, if they have been rehabilitated, then they should be released. But there has to be some process to allow for meaningful consideration of their chance of release. But we're quietly confident, but it's not going to be until 2016 that you'll probably get a decision from the Supreme Court on that. And then if they find that it is retroactive, then the states will then have to put in place systems to allow a meaningful opportunity for folks like for your son to be considered for release. Sure.
Yes, over here. Oh, Morgan. Hi. So Morgan asks, is there any place in the world where they're doing this right?
Well, there is no other country in the world that that gives life without parole sentences. So.
But in terms of the rehabilitation,
Doing it wrong.
Yeah, we're really doing it wrong.
We are really out of step with the rest of the world. There is no other country in the world that does this, and I.
Well,
I don't know if I could single one out.
Israel is the best. No, I mean,
Israel is the one other country that, at least in the books you said, has that law. So
Well, no,
we're on
think
the same axis.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think that it's not a question of whether there are countries that do it. I think you can look internationally at many good models for juvenile justice. You can look, but you don't have to go that far. There's a lot of good work being done here in the United States, a lot of rehabilitative work in the community with kids. So I think there are models out there. We had when we started working with the judges and who are presiding over cases who were tried as adults. We noticed that there was a whole host of services that were not available to these youth that were available in the family court. So one of them was a service where instead of looking at just the kid, they look at the whole family and work with the family at rehabilitation and try to resolve the issues that led to an arrest. And obviously, the more, it becomes more complicated when the nature of the crime is more severe. There is less tolerance towards these kind of programs. There is less openness to it, and you have to understand it. I mean, when I'm kind of gonna shift a little bit from your question, but one of the things that I really hope that when you do your projects and when you are involved in design, to really get people thinking about this issue in a different way. Because we're all sitting here and we're all very touched by the film. We're all very impacted. But you know how you go home and you speak with your parents and you tell them that you just saw this film and it moved you, and then you have a parent that goes like, these kids are really dangerous and you guys are willing to go. These are the people that we need to get. I mean, you really need to try to get this conversation beyond where you have consensus, and I think that that's where you find an opportunity for change, and then the models exist. You know, the models and other ways of doing things right. They do exist, but there needs to be a political will to do this, and that's really the point.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Robin? Very good question. I'm not sure I can repeat the whole thing, but I think you got it. And I'm wondering, Robin, was your question the one that did we email about this today? Okay, good. I told her I would use her question, but I'm glad you asked it because this is why I didn't ask it. It was the question about race and socioeconomic status and these factors and how they play into the issue. And Robin, it was worded so beautifully. Hold on. Here we go. So, youth incarceration is clearly connected to race and class, placing those who are most vulnerable at higher risk of a lifetime of incarceration. Can you speak to your experience with these power dynamics? And then she says, you know, how would the laws maybe change if this was happening to middle or upper class white people? And the film sort of touches on the race issue too. So, if anyone wants to take that.
I can try with an anecdote that has less to do with the film and more with a course that I'm teaching at the School of the Art Institute, where I took a group of students, for the most part, white, middle class, you know, the average School of the Art Institute student, to a juvenile institution, and in their institution they collaborated with inmates that were for the most part black, inner city youth, on producing short videos together collaboratively over the course of a semester. And the experience, I think, on both sides was extremely intense and productive and wonderful. And we just finished it last semester, and I got them a space to screen it last weekend. And they, again, most of the audience in the space was their cohorts. We showed the series of 6 videos. And after the screening, I invited the director of the youth facility to say something on their end of the reception of that course, and also on the his sense of the video work, etc. And he stood up. He was black, grew up in the city, South Side, Chicago, and kind of but definitely is much more familiar with the landscape that the youth were coming from than any of us. And he said the collaboration was wonderful. It changed everything in terms of the type of education system that they're producing, etc., etc. But he has to admit that it was a huge disappointment to see the videos that were produced by my class. And he just put that statement in the middle of the room and had all of these people that were trying for 3 months to cross over, cope with the fact that for him, they didn't. They replicated the cliche of the white I don't know, do-gooder coming into the prison and getting only the surface image of the inner city black youth. They totally bought into the fabricated identity that those youth were producing on the surface of their life, you know, the drug habits and gang activity, and they didn't poke through that surface, and they didn't revise for themselves and for the kids the identity in their projects. And it started an amazing conversation that lasted till midnight, which was really honest and true, and I think for me, summed up the problem and also maybe part of the cure, because the problem is kind of infinite. We really can't cross over. And all we can do is maybe try to hear something and maybe try to, represent the blind spots that we have and represent the blind spots that they have. And in that effort, maybe something will leak that will tell us also about them and about us and about the impossibility of dialogue, and that would form the basis of another level of dialogue. But it's a really long process, and it takes, I think, a lot of courage, which those kids and that my students had, but also just admission of the failure was part of that process. So I think for me it was really maybe the most acute conversation about race that I've witnessed in that type of context.
Moment that I wanted to share with you. You know, when I was watching this film, which happens in Michigan, I was thinking about someone that I hope you all Google after. His name is TJ Parcell. He was tried as an adult in Michigan under these laws and was raped in prison as a juvenile. And I got to work with him very closely, and today he was actually testifying in Michigan, trying to convince the legislator to raise the age of criminal responsibility over there from 17 to 18. But with him, I actually experienced a very interesting moment, which touches on your question. The New York Assembly was holding hearings, and it was very important for me and the judge I work for to have TJ come and speak with the legislator and talk about this experience that happened to him in prison, so they get an idea about the risks that kids are exposed to in adult institutions. And TJ is white. He's white, and he's very professor-looking, and he came in and he started speaking, and he was talking about his book that he wrote and the film that he made, and he was talking about all the work he did for the passage of a bill called the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and really made this presentation of him being an expert. And then he said, but most of all, I'm an expert at this because I, as a youth, was in an adult prison. And all these legislators, you know, they were like looking down at their papers, and you could see like their heads. And it was so obvious to me that they were stunned by the idea that it's a white man speaking about this experience. And it touches on your issue. We don't imagine, we imagine maybe others going through this, and we have to look at them, at these kids as our kids. And that's something that it's a dynamic that is part of this conversation, for sure.
Yes, Maya. Yeah, so Maya's asking about what the experience is for any of these people who get out of jail.
And I think it's bleak. I mean, the sort of reentry is the term used in the field, but sort of like bringing people back into community upon release is I mean, it's another very bleak spot and a place, again, where America does a terrible job. I mean, people have criminal records, they have felony records, employment is very difficult. In New York City, just as one example, if you have a felony criminal record, you cannot live in public housing necessarily. And also, this wouldn't necessarily apply to people coming home after, if for some reason they were able to get a life without parole sentence commuted, which I think is extremely rare. And I think, unless there's the kind of hearings that Stephen was talking about through the Supreme Court, people don't come home from those sentences. But in New York, a young person can't live in public housing with a felony criminal record. I believe it's for 5 years, even if they're 17 and their parent has a legal obligation to give them shelter or face child neglect charges. So there are so many barriers to people who have criminal records around employment, deportation, housing, as well as mental trauma. Many people inside face sexual abuse, rape, dehumanization. People who have been in solitary confinement, which can exacerbate or cause mental illness. I sometimes talk about, I don't spend a lot of time inside facilities, but I do go inside both youth and adult facilities, and I've experienced every time I go inside, the impact on me is so profound, and I'm someone who walks in knowing I'll walk out, treated very well, usually they're in some kind of like monitoring or evaluation role, so like, the administration is trying to show that things are okay, right? I sometimes leave for lunch and sit outside and come back in. So in no way does that experience mirror what it's like to be inside. And yet I am psychologically shaken really profoundly by the energy, the feeling, what happens. It's like kind of like a mind swirl. I find it hard to think when I'm inside. I've made poor judgments, like really poor judgments, because I get really cloudy and it's hard to think straight. It's depressing. And that's, again, as a visitor with like the freedom to walk in and out. And I think about what that does to a young person or an adult. And I think people face tremendous difficulty when they come home. And again, it's just not something that we as a society, we don't forget welcoming people home. We make it hard for them to come home and to not go back, because we put up barrier after barrier after barrier, particularly around employment.
Do you want to talk to anything about the experience of anyone? What was the name of the man?
Donny is really the only juvenile that is out, so there's no real way to assess what the experience of the youth coming out would be except through his. And I think his is both inspiring and incredible. I don't know if you catch, but also when you see those kids playing ball in the street, he's one of them. Even though he's close to 60, he's catching up on all the things he didn't do, and he's just one of the people out there, and he's catching up through the self reading and but on the other hand, the climb is so steep, and there's so much trauma, and every time he tries to even represent it, he's been on various panels. When I had screenings, I invited him several times, and every time he touches on the story, it just breaks, and you see it in the film, and you see it every time he speaks. It's like the pain of it is just so close to the surface, and I don't know if it can heal. And then that's outside all the logistics, I think, that are part of your question. Like there is no job. He lives with his mother. It's going to take a long time, if ever, to really recover mastery on the basic procedures. Drive at night. The time. The traffic is very, very violent. Experienced very violently or aggressively, because life in prison doesn't have that. There's all these little details that we're not even conscious of different styles of behaviors outside, that he's now 55, 56, trying to master. So.
the back end is a huge issue. To show, because once you come before one of these, say a parole board or some kind of board that's going to be created after the Supreme Court, after the Supreme Court's decision, or there are other schemes that states have been putting in place, resentencing schemes, and the Supreme Court requires them to look at rehabilitation, but it's to judge if they've been rehabilitated and they're ready to be released. It's going to be highly problematic for all the reasons Abby was saying.
Is there anything that you were proposing to put in place to prepare people, like programs that we have at San Quentin or the long-term responsibility project that was tried out here in New York State?
To prepare them for the parole board hearings, yes. Yeah.
So there are going to be things.
I mean, I personally have not been involved in those processes, but I think it's something that's going to have to be seriously looked at. Otherwise, they're not going to get a fair shake before the parole board. Parole boards and meaningful opportunity for release. That's a whole issue unto itself. I mean, parole boards. My understanding, I have very limited understanding of them, but often the hearing is very perfunctory. There's very little by way of due process. I think that whole review process itself is going to have to be looked at seriously, so that it actually gives a fair chance to these individuals coming up before them.
I'm not an expert on this area at all, but I have heard someone who works in the area speak about, and it made a lot of sense to me, was work that's done to help people prepare to talk about particularly the crime they committed, because that is something that's always asked about, and it's something where there's so much attention paid to the answer, and that for people that prison generally does not encourage people to speak about, the crime that they committed, and particularly if that crime, in many of these cases was violent, involved a homicide, that for people who maybe haven't talked about that for 20 or 25 years, and where the stakes are so high, that really, we're one of what I've heard, and it's made sense to me, is kind of coaching around doing that and having people tell their stories before they're before a parole board in a supported way, so that they've at least said the words out loud. Again, I'm not an expert on how that would be done, but that always made a lot of sense to me. And again, it goes back to just core humanity, that what I think we need is to really have a lens where we're thinking about what people's experience as human beings are, and that no matter what anyone has done, they are more than the worst. We are all more than the worst thing that we've ever done. And again, that's not at odds with accountability, but learning how to hold that space for other people, and to have that built into our system, so our system can handle that and is built with that as a guiding principle. And that's a shift of the heart, and a shift of the mind, and it's a shift of the spirit, and it's a shift that goes beyond legislation. And we need legislative change, and we need policy change, and we have to fight for those things, and we need you to help us fight for those things. But we also have to shift the way our humanity is reflected in our institutions, and we need you for that too.
Maybe just take a couple more. You had your hand up down here.
Based on the idea of having
Such a great question. We can all go away armed with our argument, and this is a bunch of attorneys up here, so.
I think it's a complete change in our in the criminal justice system. To you imprison people. Part of the imprisonment should be a rehabilitative goal, and that's been forgotten about for kids, but also for adults. And I think rehabilitation is and change of focus, at federal, state level towards rehabilitation, a rehabilitative goal of imprisonment.
I mean, in terms of the what the opposition is, or the view of trying children as adults, first of all, and I think you heard part of this in the film, this kind of view that you as a kid, if you commit an adult crime, you need to do an adult time, and I think there are many other arguments against it. There are a lot of systemic issues. There are many people, who just say, this system is working. Why are you changing it? You will face many arguments in opposition. But I think that when you think about this issue and you want to challenge people in this debate, is the real question and the real way to get into this conversation. It's not about talking points, but really having a conversation, is to really ask, what is it that you want to achieve through this system? And I think that once you open that question, you discover that many times the concern that people have is about dangerousness. And I think that's a valid concern, and I think that's a concern that can be addressed in a balanced way. But once you have that conversation, you recognize the fear of the other side, and you really explain that the system that you want is a system that can make these distinctions, that can really focus on kids that are dangerous, that can really monitor them. Maybe some of them will need lengthy confinement again, but at the same time, you want a system that is able to look at kids, and I'm not only talking about kids who are accused of very serious crimes. I'm talking about all kids who are being tried as an adult. You want a system that will be able to see these kids and use any opportunity out there to that exists to really make sure that they don't come back again. And that's really the thought process. We have in New York State every year about 40,000 kids who come into contact with the adult court system because New York sets the age of criminal responsibility at 16. And many people will tell you, well, many of these cases get dismissed anyway. Yes, but are we really using the opportunity to really address what has caused this kid to come before us? And finally, are we really looking at them as kids? Someone here talked about sex trafficking. Who was it? This is actually an issue that I've been working on because New York had a safe harbor law, but it went only up to 16. And 2 years ago, I started working with a bunch of legislators, and in the end of the process, New York actually did expand its safe harbor law to the age of 18. But the conversations we were having were crazy because you were looking at the law and it said that when you're a minor, you cannot consent to sex. But on the other hand, you can be arrested as an adult for prostitution. And at the same time, we had all these dynamics where pimps were basically benefiting from this system where kids who are 16 are being charged as adults because suddenly, you would set bail on them, who would pay bail, the pimp. But I'm bringing that example. It's because when you take kids out of their contexts and try to look at them through lens which don't represent who they are, you get a system that doesn't make sense, and in the end of the day, you get a system that compromises public safety because it doesn't really address the needs of that kid, and doesn't need. I mean, the kids who are getting juvenile life without parole, this is a small subset of kids, and yes, we need to address this. But the vast majority of kids who come into the system, they're coming back, and even if they're accused of very serious offenses, because they're so young, they're coming back. And the question is, and that's the question to ask the opposition. And that's when you get the engagement. And that's when you start seeing people saying, well, yes, I am law and order, but I don't want to see these kids going to adult facilities. Yes, I do want to see that there will be some kind of rehabilitation. I do want to make sure that they can get education and not be forever judged for one mistake they made at a young age. But you have to engage in conversation. It's not going to come through talking points, because otherwise you're just going to scare them and they're going to say, well, you're crazy. What are you doing? These kids are dangerous.
I'd like to ask each of you to maybe, Tirtza, you could talk to us about what's happening with the project now, or what next, what kind of life it has moving forward. And then also anything that, we could take away from this evening, and things we can do, or how we could help, or how we can push the issue forward. That was a great question along those lines.
So what's happening with the project now? It's kind of traveling mainly in the two formats: the installation and the single channel. The interactive version of it, which I think will be kind of opening the story in a different way to maybe a different kind of public, is going to be hopefully completed. At least a draft version of it will be completed next month. And then there is an offshoot film that is in the works on the one inmate, Efren Paredes, who is slightly different than the other stories because he's claiming innocence. And so the film, which is a collaboration that I'm working on right now, is going to be addressing some of the fallacies, again, in the system that happen when somebody claims innocence. For instance, if retroactivity does apply and he would be inside a system where he's going to be resentenced or tested for parolability, his claim for innocence is actually creating a catch-22, because part of what they want to see is regret, and without remorse you're not eligible. And so that we're going to be addressing both his claim for innocence, but also what happens with that claim within the system in this new piece.
Sorry, I just have to ask the one question that's pretty obvious and artistic, and you're the only person who can address it, is why the two screens? Or the two fields, what would you call that?
Split screen is the term. Why it wasn't born that way. It kind of happened after, I think, 2 years of editing that didn't yield a piece. And I was asked to show it in a gallery setting, and so I created that corner version, 10 minutes of it. And something happened for me in terms of finally I understood that maybe is the way I understand the project, the issue, that it's always coming, that it should always be examined from more than one perspective, that the perspectives should not be stable. It shouldn't be, left is me and right is them, or inside, outside, but that the categories themselves should be shuffled throughout the film. And that you will always be confronting, if nothing else, the fact that there is difference, which is what the law doesn't address, difference, and the fact that there is change in terms of the meaning of words. For instance, one sentence in one context mean one thing, and another meaning in another settings, which again, change and difference are the two things that the law does not approach or consider, and that's part of what the battle is about. So I felt like I found a form that would actually propose that indirectly.
That's beautiful. Effective.
So one thing I would tell you guys after tonight is that you should get informed in the issue, and I think by coming here tonight, you've started that process. But there's a one-stop shop. It's a great campaign. They have a website. They actually have an office down in DC. It's called the Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth. And they pull together all the various local campaigns around the country. They coordinate action towards ending life without parole sentences nationwide. They've got, there's former life without parolers on the board. Deb LaBelle's on the board. I think Tirtza, you've probably been involved with them as well. The campaign for fair sentencing.
I think that's part of the
Yeah.
people that supported the project.
Yeah. So I would strongly advise you to get involved with the campaign there. They've got various actions that you can take both here in New York and elsewhere.
I would encourage you to follow Tirtza and to create your own projects. I had this, I mentioned before this person, TJ Parcell, who's a film director, we had a bunch of interns in our organization, and they wrote this short film, a 90-second film called Because I'm 16. And it was basically, kids saying, I'm 16, I can't drive at night, I'm 16, I can't buy a lottery ticket alone. And then they go like, but I can go to Attica, I can go to Rikers Island. And it was just, and we brought him in, and they shot it, by the way, with their cell phones. And they came with this raw thing. And then we brought him in, and he did it more professionally. And this thing kind of, it's been viewed like more than 80,000 times, and it really sparked a conversation. And it was the use of art as a way to really communicate. And if you guys, are most of you film students, or what is the composition?
Designers. Who are you?
Yeah.
Designers, artists.
So the design. Is it interaction design? Just use your craft because that's, you can really change the conversation, and that's really my call for action. Use this weapon that you have. Yeah, like that.
I know. Look at that. That's amazing. Use your craft.
Yes,
That's beautiful.
to really change the perspective, and that's my call to action.
Cool. Very cool.
So I would say a couple of things. One, I would build on what Yuval said and also think about small ways. Like, I work in a relatively small nonprofit. Many of us do. And sometimes we try really hard to be, many of our organizations, I think, try to use art and design and graphic design, but we often don't have those things in-house, and they're also expensive. So if you're a graphic designer, if you can, volunteer to create a logo, like things like that can take materials that are otherwise a little policy wonky and dry, and you can help us figure out like how to, and when I say us, I don't just mean my organization, but I mean the field, how to take what we're saying and make it more reach the public, be on social media more. Those are things that there might be a real high payoff for a relatively small investment of your time, and maybe something also that you can use in your portfolio or, as you apply to the next stage of your career. I think Yuval and I spoke a little bit about raising New York's age of criminal responsibility. So this year, the governor had legislation in his budget which would have changed New York's age from 16 to 17 in 2017 and 18 in 2018, so ultimately to 18 for the bulk of cases, and would have gotten kids out of adult jails and prisons. The legislation did not pass in the budget, but there was money, $135 million, did pass to try to implement this session, but it's an uphill battle. It's a hard battle. There's a lot of us working really hard. We need help. I don't have a specific call to action at this moment because this just happened and we're strategizing around that. So one thing you can do is visit the Correctional Association, which is just correctionalassociation.org. You can see me after this. I'll give you my card. We will, we and other organizations will be issuing calls to action, like calling your legislators, signing a petition. We did a change.org petition and got 4,000 or 5,000 signatures in a matter of a week or two, which was really showed to us that people do care on a scale you don't sometimes see on this issue. I mentioned a Juvenile Justice Coalition. That's a broad group of stakeholders. We'd love to have you join. Again, you can see me. And I think another thing just to think about is when you see, there was the school teacher in the film who talked about, I think it was Ephraim being sort of tried in the press, and thinking about the role of the media. And when you see articles, write a letter to the editor. Think about writing an op-ed. Think about how you can use your words as well as your art to take a stand, because this is a culture war. And it is, we talked about this a little bit before, it is the casualties are children of color, almost exclusively. You know, I've been doing this work for about a decade, and it is not shifted, and there are people who've been doing it much longer than me. But when I came in, we do a fact sheet every year where we talk about what percentage of kids in pretrial detention in New York, so locked up while they're waiting for their cases to be heard, are black and brown, and what percentage are white. I've been making the fact sheet for about 5 years. The whole time I've been here, it's been about 95% black and white. 95% black and brown kids and about 5% or less white kids every year. Like, we sometimes modify like that portion of the fact sheet. We're like 94.8. Oh, this year it was like 95 or 95.1. And one day I was cleaning out my filing cabinets, and I probably should have done it years before when I started my job, but I didn't. Now you know that about me. And I saw the fact sheets that my predecessor had made maybe like 10 years before that, and they had the same number. And, you know, I often talk about, when I speak publicly, some of the crimes that I committed as a teenager, and that, like, those were not the punishment. I didn't go to prison for those things. You know, I smoked pot, I stole, I did vandalism, you know, and I talk about that a lot because I think it's important to say that, and it's really important to bring attention to that. And so this is it's a cultural shift that has to happen, as well as a legislative and policy shift. And so I think the more you can bring your voices and your words and your art and your skills, and then the very last thing, I know I just said a bunch of things, but like, don't design solitary confinement cells, or, you know, like, seriously though, like, there are people who do that, and I really wonder, you know, when they're drawing, if you're sitting there, I'm old school, like, when they're at their drafting board, that probably doesn't exist anymore, but when they're in front of their laptop, or, you know, but how disconnected we can all become, all of us. It's not an indictment of designers. We can all become disconnected from what we're putting in the world and how it's put to use, right? The people who design weapons, you know, there's can be a disconnect. And design can be a weapon or a thing for good as well as for bad. And so I just encourage you to be mindful about that and think about whether you're using your gifts, you know, toward the project of elevating or toward the project of dehumanization.
Very good. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, to Tirtza for making this beautiful, beautiful and important film. And thank you guys for being here and being a part of this.